All right. Okay. Now, I used to have a good friend, haven't heard from him in years, who was the director of the National Archives at Atlanta. And he used to give an excellent talk on National Archives records. But when it came to military records, he would refer to military records as the croutons of genealogy. He said they were like croutons on a salad bar. You really didn't care for them, but you'd miss them if they weren't there. Well, he was completely wrong. Military records are a wonderful source of information. Many a time I have cracked a case wide open. I found the answers that I needed through military records. But you have to understand the military records. You have to understand their limitations. All right, wars cost a huge amount of money, and it takes forever to pay off a war. Believe it or not, today's national debt was started by paying pensions to Revolutionary War veterans in the 1830s. And we've never paid off the national debt since then. And then the national debt was further exploded by the American Civil War and then by the United States in two world wars. And the list goes on and on. But basically, our national debt comes from our military adventures and our military campaigns. But for us as genealogists, it is all this debt that is the key to everything. Trying to pay everybody what is owed, which never completely happens. Paying what needs to be what is owed leaves wonderful records, and those wonderful records can give us all sorts of valuable information to help us fill out our family tree. Military records are not just about knowing which side your ancestor was on in the American Civil War, not knowing if your ancestor, to find out if your ancestor was in the Revolution, to join organizations like the Sons of the American Revolution or the United Daughters of the Confederacy or something. It's also a great way of finding personal information. And we'll talk about this. Now, one of the first problems that we have with military records is that the majority of people never serve in the military. And that even includes most men never serve in the military. You're just lucky enough to have been of military age at a time when there was no conflict or they didn't need you in the conflict as this goes. Um, for example, I registered for the Vietnam draft the day before President Nixon canceled it. And I don't know how you feel about President Nixon, but there'll always be a warm spot in my heart for him. But as this is. However, there's a trick around that. And this is not just a trick in military records, this is also a trick in any genealogy that you're doing. And that is think about the siblings. All right, you've got 9 kids. All you know about these 9 kids is they were all born in South Carolina. You don't know where or anything like that. However, one of these children was born in Lexington District, South Carolina. What does that suggest to you about where the other 8 are born? Even if you descend from one of the other. Yeah, I'd go looking for this family in Lexington District, South Carolina myself. Okay. Anyway, as they say, that's a trick that also works with death certificates and other records as well. Look for, if you find information on one of the children, it may well apply to other members of the family too. And that certainly goes true with military records. Now, military records, as I say, might help you to join organizations like the UDC, the SAR, the DAR, the Society of the Cincinnati. Military records, okay, the kind of personal information that military records can give you include age, marriage, place of birth, death, etc. Seldom, though, do you find military records where you'll get the names of the parents. And of course, that's what most of the time we are looking for. But with military records, that is often not going to be the case. Although there can be exceptions. There can be exceptions. I descend from a man named Jesse Hammondtree. And Jesse Hammondtree was so much despised in the family that nobody remembered his name. They just knew that there was some terrible scandal connected with him. All right, in the 1860 federal census, I find my ancestor, Sam Tate Hammondtree, in Jesse Hammondtree's household. I have no doubt Jesse is Sam's father, but none of the kids named children Jesse, so that should tell you something right there. Okay, well, anyway, Sam Hammontree in his Civil War memoirs, he fought for 3 years under Robert E. Lee, and he left me a memoir that's 1.5 typed pages, double spaced. But be that as it may, in that he talks about at the Battle of Chancellorsville, his brother Steve died in his arms. Okay, I looked in Steve Hammontree's Confederate service record, and who should show up demanding the money that was still owed to his son, Steve, but Jesse Hammontree. So indirectly, I proved that Sam Hammontree, who said that he was Steve's brother, is also Jesse's son, and therefore they're all my ancestors as this goes. Okay, so sometimes, like I say, you have to be a little creative, but in any kind of investigation, especially genealogy, being creative is how you get your answers. If I often say, if the front door doesn't work for me, there's always the chimney, the back window, whatever. And no, contrary to rumor, I do not descend from a long line of burglars. But like I said, there's nothing wrong with coming through the back door or by some other means. Okay, now, one of the myths about American military records is that all the military records are kept in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Now, the federal government does have a lot of military records, and we're going to talk about that. A lot of military records, but particularly for the early years, a lot of records have been lost, but especially for the American Revolution. Many of the records that were in the federal government for the American Revolution were destroyed in various fires, including when the British burned the government buildings in Washington in 1814. Most of what, for say, the American Revolution you find at the National Archives is either after the fire of 1814 or it's something that was donated to the federal government to help the old soldiers and their widows prove service for purposes of getting pensions. But we have people who come to my library at Wallace State in Hansville. Professor Davis, I so wanted to join the DAR, but I contacted the National Archives and I looked through your wonderful collection of federal records from the American Revolution, and I can't find my grandpa anywhere. Could he possibly have been a Tory? And I say, certainly he could be a Tory or a loyalist, but don't give up on him just yet. Individual states for the American Revolution have records of thousands and thousands of Revolutionary War soldiers for whom there is no record at the National Archives. A very good example of that is North Carolina's Revolutionary War accounts and vouchers, which we have at Wallace State. The originals are at the North Carolina Archives. Fabulous source. You'll find thousands of Revolutionary War soldiers' services documented in those records, and they're very well indexed, I should mention as well, and documented in those records where you'll find no other record of their service anywhere. And we have similar records, I should say, for South Carolina as well. Most of the original 13 states have that. Now, the point I'm trying to get at is this: all the way up to modern times, records were also kept at the state level and sometimes at the local level. At the state level and sometimes at the local level. So, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, but always check at the state archives for military records, as well as the local public library where you're in the area where your ancestor would have served, the state archives for the state where your ancestor would have served. Check the sources there, and you could very easily be pleasantly surprised at what turns up that's not available at the National Archives. Okay. Also check historical societies if they have an archives or a library, particularly local historical societies. All right, now, you know your ancestors served. You know when your ancestors served and you know who your ancestors served under. Okay, but other than that, you've just got a few little bitty cards and records that show that he served, who he served under, and when he served under. Okay, look up the history of that unit and see where that unit served. And then check for biographies of its leaders, histories of the battles that it fought in, and the campaigns that it was in. The National Archives has a record of my ancestor, Samuel King. My ancestor, Samuel King, served in the 11th Virginia Infantry in the American Revolution. Okay? You look up, and there's a very good book in Virginia on its Revolutionary War units. The 11th Virginia Infantry was under the famous Daniel Morgan. And they served in Quebec. They served at Brandywine. They were at Valley Forge. So maybe you can't find a heartbeat by heartbeat account of your ancestor's service, but maybe if you know what happened with his unit, you can see the adventures he would have had. Your Civil War ancestor, North or South, could not read and write. Your Civil War ancestor, North or South, did not leave you his memoirs, did not leave you letters written home. Your ancestor did not leave a diary of his adventures. But in most state archives and other sources, we'll talk about this more in a moment, you can look up the unit and you can find diaries and letters and memoirs written by men who were in the same unit. And would not a letter or a diary from someone who was in the same unit or in a modern conflict, a living person who was in the same unit, would that not be just as good to you or almost as good to you as if you had found it from your ancestor directly? And again, we're going to talk more about that this afternoon. Okay. Now, be very careful with family stories. And I love family stories. It's like what every treasure hunter will ever tell you. Uh, Behind every legend, there's at least a grain of truth. However, you have to be careful. First thing is, most Americans know next to nothing about history. I know, I'm a history teacher, okay? And all I have to do to throw my hands up in the air and say that my life has been wasted is listening to a politician talking about history. That just, you know, I'm just standing there saying, gee, I would have flunked him if he'd been one of my students, I'm sure. But anyway, be that as it may. Okay, anyway, most people do not, but that doesn't stop us from having opinions on American history. So be very careful about that. Back home, some nice ladies went around the community interviewing people for family stories, and then they published the family stories. And one of these family stories had it, and my ancestor joined in the war against Spain, and he served under Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders in the Philippines. Okay, what's wrong with that story? Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders served in Cuba, not in the Philippines. Okay, now I don't know if the ladies who were putting the interviews together injected that mistake, or this was just the assumption the person who's telling them these stories has added to it. Okay, and some family stories you'll never be able to prove. My grandfather, he supposedly enlisted in the United States Army in World War I because he figured the draft is the only lottery he would ever win. Anyway, he hated the Army to the day he died. He used to sit beside me and tell me how much he hated the Army. He said, they make you sleep in a tent and you have to bathe in the river. Those people are animals. Anyway, let me say in my grandfather's defense, I wish the world had more people like him. Anyway, he said that he whined and cried about his father was dying and his family needed him till the Army finally couldn't take it anymore and let him go. His father died in 1932 and was hit by a train. But anyway, some years after World War I, obviously. So anyway, know that family stories can be true, or at least they have a basis in truth. But do understand that some of the stories can be embellished and falsified. I have a half brother. His father told me that as soon as he lied about his age to join the Army Air Corps in World War II, that his father was very mean to his children. They all ran away from home as soon as they were able to, and all this good stuff. Well, that's all well and good, but with my help, what you're going to learn today, My half brother looked up his father's service record. His father was 21 when he joined the military, and he was living with his parents at the time. He didn't run away from home. But my stepfather, who I dearly loved, he just liked to embellish the stories a bit. And there's something even behind embellishment sometimes, if you think about it. And you have to, my late friend, the great historian, Dr. E. Merton Coulter, he would read wonderful books on local histories, legends and such, like the tree that owned itself, and the story of Nancy Hart and things like that. But he would look into how a story grows and develops. So even when you know something is wrong, sometimes it's important to try to find out why it is wrong. That is how this legend was attached to the story, and all of which will make your family history a bestseller and maybe the exciting sequel to Angela's Ashes. All right, another important thing to know about military records. We had a military in this country for 100 years before we had a country. That is, this country was found shooting from day one, if you would. We had numerous colonial military conflicts. And there's most of the books on the colonial soldiers. Here we're talking about the last of the Mohegans. We're talking about George Washington at Fort Necessity. We're talking about the French and Indian Wars in that sort of environment. Most of the colonial records are kept by the individual state archives, and many of them have been published and published by state. And among some really good books, Lloyd DeWitt Bachstruck's book, Virginia's Colonial Soldiers, and his book, Bounty and Donation Land Grants in British Colonial America. Oh, and let's not forget Bertie June Clark's Colonial Soldiers of the South, which are colonial soldiers' records for Georgia and the two Carolinas. But anyway, for colonial records, that is records before the American Revolution, check at the respective state archives where your ancestors served. Where your ancestors served. Okay. Now, keep in mind also that just because your ancestors served in the colonial wars does not necessarily mean that he served for the British. Of course, the Spanish and the French and the Dutch had armies as well, and they have records. They have records. Mobile has wonderful records of its colonial period and some of its colonial soldiers. And you might discover that not very far from here, your ancestor served at Fort Tilloux, a French outpost. When France had a dream that Alabama and the western United States would be part of the French Empire, and maybe Fort Tilloux was going to be its capital. But anyway, of course, many veterans of many wars, right up to the present day, are foreign born. It might surprise you to learn that the United States has always welcomed immigrants and foreigners to join our military, but never so much as when our back is against a wall. When in the United States military, pretty much anything goes. Anything goes when we are desperate. But that's the way Americans are. We do what we have to do. All right, a good example of this is Texas rebellion from Mexico. All right, your ancestor was at the Alamo, or was with Sam Houston at San Jacinto, or was it Goliad or something like that? Do not write to the National Archives for records, because the federal government had nothing to do with Texas rebellion from Mexico. Instead, you write to the Texas State Library, or you write to the Texas State Land Office. Because after the Texas revolt from Mexico, the state of Texas gave land to the families of the men who helped Texas to win its independence. Okay. All right. Almost all of the federal records, almost all the federal records of the American Revolution have been microfilmed. That's the good news. The better news is almost all of those records that have been microfilmed have been scanned onto the subscription sites Fold3 and Ancestry. Fold3 and Ancestry. And Fold3 is dedicated largely to military records. Fold 3, Fold 3, number 3, which is the 3 folds in a flag at a military funeral. But fold 3. Now, as I said, these are subscription sites, but many public libraries, I'm sure yours here, as a matter of fact, have subscriptions to Fold 3 and to Ancestry, and you can go on there for free at your public library and look for your ancestors there. Now, I should mention, by the way, Ancestry and Fold 3 both also have a lot of military records that come from other places, not just from the National Archives, All right. Now, moving right along about the American Revolution. Um, Again, as I said before, don't just look for your ancestors' service record, which is your primary focus and what you should do, but also look for your ancestors' unit history, and any sources and papers and such on that. Now, every branch of the United States military has an archive. You can find them online and you can write them a letter. You can ask them, do you have information on this unit? And they will search their files. For example, your great uncle served in World War II, He passed a long time ago. But if you write to the United States Army Archives at Carlisle Barracks, they will have his unit histories. This was sort of like a high school yearbook, but it was for every year in the military. It had pictures, it had personal histories. The combat histories are not always credible because we always wanted to put the United States in the best light. And there's some things that happened that are better not remembered. Like in that wonderful movie, What Did You Do in the Great War, Daddy? Where this American unit and this German unit are supposed to be fighting over this village. And what they do is each takes turn driving the other one out. And then with the local people, they have a big party. And then they're driven out by the other side and have another big party. And the hero of the movie says, we must have liberated that village 15 times. And the Germans just as often. Okay, I'm sure nothing like that really happened in World War II. Okay, but anyway, as this is, we'll talk more about that in a moment as well. All right, Revolutionary War records can be state records, they can be local records, they can be federal records that can prove your ancestor's service. But too often, the service record is just your ancestor getting paid for donating a chicken to the cause or something. Or he was in the Rutherford County Militia for 3 months in 1781 or something like that. It's not a huge amount of information on your ancestor's service, as this goes. However, sometimes federal pension records can be a great exception to this. Okay, Lloyd Boxstruck, he did a book, Revolutionary War Pensions, which is early federal and state pensions. Now, these are not great in information. The actual service is usually only mentioned in passing. But there were thousands of Americans who, prior to 1818, received Revolutionary War pensions, either from their state government or from the United States government. Now, the state governments and the United States government were very, very reluctant to pay out pensions. You had to be seriously, seriously crippled or desperate for the government to give you a pension. But Lloyd Boxstruck's book will tell you if any of your family qualified for that. All right, now, from 1832 on, in 1820, the United States government actually decided to pay some of the money that they owed to their Continental soldiers. Now, keep in mind, the revolution's been over since 1783, and the government is deciding to pay these guys in 1820. Do the math. Okay, so they offered to pay these boys something. Only a handful of old soldiers showed up to collect their money. So the government determines by 1832, in 1832, Andrew Jackson became the only president of the United States to retire the national debt. He paid off the national debt. In one of the few times in American history, Congress had more money than it knew what to do with. So Thomas Hart Benton and other silver-tongued congressmen got up before Congress. They didn't have C-SPAN back then, and said that we owed these last few veterans a symbol of our gratitude for when they were in their youth and they saved American liberty when it was in its cradle, the last eyes that beheld George Washington. I tell you, when Benton got through, there wasn't a dry eye in the House, and Congress could not vote fast enough to give the last few Revolutionary War veterans pensions. 80,000 pension claims were filed. This bankrupted the United States, and this began the modern day national debt with that. And then on top of that, 6 years later, what does Congress do? They give a pension to the widows of the Revolutionary War veterans. Now, that's all sort of beside the matter here. The Revolutionary War pensions have been scanned onto 1832 on, have been scanned onto the site Fold 3, and they are amazing to read. Okay, most of these old boys did not have any documents to back up their service, so instead they give you a heart-wrenching narrative of the services and sacrifices that they had. I was with General Rutherford's North Carolina militia, and we protected General Greene's army when he was fleeing Cornwallis in the race to the Dan. And General Cornwallis and his whole army, we got them across the Dan River in safety. That's when we realized that we and the rafts were on the wrong sides of the river. And General Cornwallis's army shows up, and they are the prettiest thing I ever saw. But we were on the wrong side of the river and no way to get on the other side. It is at that moment that General Rutherford issued those immortal words: "Follow me to the rear, boys, and be quick about it." Followed by "run." Okay, now, anyway, if you're lucky enough to find ancestors who file for pensions from 1832 on, the pensions can be a gold mine of personal information. You get a special, you get the narrative of their service, you get witnesses who claim to know them, who might be relatives. If the old veteran dies, his widow has to give her maiden name and when and where she married the old boy and when and where the old boy died. You find all the places the family lived from the time the veteran was born to the time the veteran died. It's just staggering what comes from those pensions. However, again, you're saying to yourself, yes, but none of my ancestors left a pension, or the ancestor I most need to have left a pension did not leave a pension. I know people, I know people who, if when they're researching someone, they check for the Revolutionary War pensions. And if that person doesn't show up, they look for everybody with that last name who shows up in the index to the Revolutionary War pensions. Everyone who served from that state. Now, this trick does not work if your last name is Smith or Davis or Jones or something like that. But for names like Hammondtree and Burleson and Haygood and things like that, of course it works. But anyway, you might find a pension claim by a brother or some other close relative. And if you follow that soldier, well, it's probably the same migration, it's the same experience that your ancestor had. All right, I once helped a friend out, and her ancestor came from the swamps of North Carolina. And even though he was illiterate, he left a will and he named the names of his children. And he did not leave a pension. He did not leave a pension. In fact, he didn't leave a whole lot of information except that he lived in this swamp. And she said that made perfectly good sense because all of her ancestors to the modern day live in a swamp somewhere. It seems that whatever your family was in North Carolina, you will always be that wherever you go. My family lived in the mountains, and we always settled someplace in mountains. Piedmont the same way, the coast the same. Anyway, getting on with that. Okay, I was going through Revolutionary War pension claims, and who should I find? But somebody with the same last name. It was Walker, in fact. Somebody with the same last name, but a different first name, who drew a Revolutionary War pension, and he was one county over. But what was truly amazing, his children all filed for the last of his pension money when he died. And I took the list of names from that pension and I compared them to the list of names in the other guy's will. They're the same names. What's going on here? They're brothers. They're brothers. And both were using the old German naming scheme. The oldest child is named for the father's father. The second son is named for the mother's father. The third son is named for the father. The fourth child is named for the father's oldest brother. Fifth for the mother's oldest brother. And the same thing with women, female babies as well. But they were obviously the same family. Now, I've got a deposition from the one who left the pension. He said what county he was born in. So I know what county both of them probably came out of. And it was one county over. And it all just fit together so perfectly. So as I stress time and again, look for the siblings. Look for the siblings. Now, even if that does not work for you, there's still another trick you can take. You know that your ancestors served under General John Twiggs during the American Revolution. All right, every Southern soldier or widow who filed for a Revolutionary War pension claim, their claims have been transcribed on the free site Southern Campaigns of the American Revolution. Southern Campaigns of the American Revolution. On that. And you can do word searches of all the pensions at one time. So let's say you know your ancestors served under General John Twiggs. Fine. You type in Twiggs, and every Revolutionary War pension claim of a man who served under Twiggs will come up on the screen, and you can read them, and this will be just as if your ancestor filed a Revolutionary War pension claim. It'll be the same marches, the same sacrifices, the same battles, the same officers. The same officers. So, and of course, you can do the same thing about battles or a county. Your ancestor was from Anson County, North Carolina. Type in Anson and see what turns up, and see the Revolutionary War world that your ancestors served in. All right, now, along the same lines, state and local genealogical journals, they love to publish Revolutionary War documents, and they love to publish obscure documents. Some piece of paper that was found stuffed in the back of a desk in the Anson County Courthouse, and it has names on it and it has value to genealogists. They will publish that. And anyway, most state and local genealogical journals are reasonably well indexed, but even when they're not, you can go through the table of contents pretty quickly and find the articles that are of interest to you in your family history. But state and local genealogical journals love military records because military records tend to be brief and to the point, and to be very popular. Many states like Alabama have books of Revolutionary War soldiers who settled in the state after the Revolution. Alabama has an excellent book on that. Also, we have the military books that were done by Pauline Gandrud, where she went through the county records and she pulled out military records from county records. We've got this through the letter S and the index all the way to Z. And we have that in our collection at Wallace State. All right, many patriotic organizations make public their members' charts. That is the information the members provided. The Daughters of the American Revolution are very good at this. And when you decide to join the DAR, I've tried to join the Daughters of the American Revolution for years, but they just won't let me in. But be that as it may, uh, that exception, they are always happy to welcome new members, and they have members whose only job it is in the group is to help you get in. And they will help you sort through all of this, help you find your ancestors and identify your ancestors. But one of the first things they do is they see if somebody else has already gotten in on your ancestor, so you can use the same sources to get your ancestor in. Same thing with the Sons of the American Revolution as well. Okay, now the Daughters of the American Revolution, and let's not get into the history of that, but the Daughters of the American Revolution have bent over backwards to encourage African Americans, Native Americans, etc., to join the DAR. They have also bent over backwards to get people to join the DAR on their women, their female patriots. People like Nancy Hart here, who is shown capturing the Tories who murdered poor Colonel Dooley, but encouraging that. And the DAR on its website has tremendous resources for researching your African American ancestor, your Native American ancestor, and your female patriot in your background. And yes, you can join these organizations on a woman ancestor. All right. Now, as I say, Americans do not know much about their history, and that's really a sad and dangerous state for us to be in. But I remember one time my little sister Michelle coming up to me and she said, "Bobby, my grandfather served in World War II. My grandfather served in World War II. Does that mean that there was once a World War I?" And you know, I didn't make fun of her or anything like that. I said, "Yes, dear, there was a World War I, and your other grandfather served in World War I." I just didn't tell her about my grandfather whining till he got out of the army. But as this goes, anyway, most Americans know of the American Revolution. They know of the Civil War. They know of World War II. They know of Vietnam. But there was an awful lot of military conflicts in between that most Americans are not familiar with. However, fortunately for us, most of these records are pretty consistent in what they contain and how you can find information on them. First off, there's a set of records on everyone who enlisted in the regular United States Army from 1798 to 1914. And this is available on Ancestry. And it is wonderful. It is wonderful. And as they say, you can use Ancestry for free at a public library. But this is enlistments in the U.S. Army 1798 to 1914. Starting in 1800, every man who joins the U.S. Army was asked his county and state of birth, his age, and his physical description, and where he was enlisting from. What was his resident county? This was in case he deserted. We know where to look for him and what he looked like. But still, this is absolutely fabulous information. That's the very thing that can break open your roadblock, your brick wall, whatever. Now, the big problem is that there were very few soldiers in the regular army in between the big wars, and where they were usually enlisted in big cities like Philadelphia. However, we had some conflicts that were so big and we were so desperate, we ran out into the countryside and beat the bushes looking for recruits, particularly the War of 1812. I asked my history students just to see what I'm dealing with in any given semester. When did the War of 1812 begin? Okay, the War of 1812 and the war with Mexico. Now there's some special tricks to these different records, and let me go through them for you, conflict by conflict. First off, that enlistments in the United States Army. That includes Native Americans who acted for the Army as scouts. It also includes African American soldiers, especially after the Civil War. when African American soldiers served as the famous Buffalo Soldiers on the frontier. They are all included. And as I said, this goes all the way up to 1914. 1914. So your ancestors may have been in, say, the war with Spain, or they may have been in just in the military period between wars. The U.S. Army has always been a popular place for immigrants because usually your English did not have to be that great. I mean, my old drill sergeant, he had no problem communicating with us, uh, um, as that goes. But as this is, also they get fed and they get a paycheck, and this gives them a chance to learn the language, get citizenship, become a part of this country. All right, moving right along here. Now, the National Archives has the records for the volunteers for these wars, arranged the same way you're seeing them on the slide. You have the Indian Wars, 1783 to 1811, the War of 1812 to 1815, which includes the Indian Wars and fights like the Battle at Horseshoe Bend, which took place not very far from here, and the massacre at Fort Mims, also not very far from here, and Fort Jackson, formerly Fort Toulouse, also not very far from here as well. Then the Indian Wars, 1816 to 1859. Then the war, also the war with Mexico, 1846 to 1848. All right, Virgil White. Virgil White has published a monster index to the pensions of the American Revolution. He has also published monster indexes to the pensions for all of these other wars. The Indian Wars, the War of 1812, the war with Mexico, indexes for these pensions. Now, unfortunately, because so many people stormed the Treasury for Revolutionary War pensions, the federal government was very reluctant to give pensions after that time. The War of 1812 veterans do not get pensions until 1867. So to get a pension for these other wars, you had to really be as old as dirt. You really, really had to be as old as dirt. I once helped somebody out from whose ancestor lived in Hall County, Georgia. Again, another walker, another walker. Okay, we could find absolutely nothing on this guy except that he died in 1863. So, you know, there would not be a Civil War pension on him. He was old as dirt. His wife died before he did, so there was really no chance there for a pension. I checked Virgil White's indexes. And in the Indian Wars for 1816 to 1859, I found a pension was applied for him, because he was a Georgia militiaman in the Cherokee Indian removal of 1838. Now, this makes absolutely no sense to me, so I immediately called my friend, collect, of course, and told my friend about it, and she said to go ahead and buy it, get her the pension. And so that's what I did for her. She sent me a check, of course, before I sent for the pension application. Anyway, we got the pension application. Turned out the whole family did not know that in his last years, he married a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. And she was still around in 1906. And in 1906, she applied for a pension for his military service. All right. What did the pension say? It gave me his county and state of birth. It gave me when he was born. It gave me the maiden name of his first wife. The second wife remembered it because she was a flower girl or something at the first wife's wedding. When the first wife died, her marriage license to the old boy, and when and where he died, of course, his military service. And then the kicker in the deck. She included, to prove that she was, in fact, his wife, his second wife, she included the only piece of paper he ever left her, which was a written agreement between him and his brothers and sisters dividing up his father's property. This was never probated. They just divided everything up and signed an agreement. Wow. you know. And as I say, this was all a mystery. It's all a mystery. Anyway, Virgil White until then, but Virgil White's books are very good for that. Now, the pensions themselves are in the National Archives and Records Administration on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., what they call National Archives 1. And you can check for these in Virgil White's books, and you can order them online from the National Archives. Now, let me warn you something about pension records. If at all ever possible, see the original pension. Do not just settle for a photocopy. Do not just settle for a microfilm copy or a copy on fold 3. Oh, by the way, the War of 1812 pensions are on fold 3 now, thanks to a generous grant by the um, Federation of Genealogical Societies. All right, now, think about that. Okay, when they photocopy something for you, something always gets left out. I have an ancestor from Gordon County, Georgia, who fought for the Union. A really weird story. He and his neighbors tried to join the Union, and instead they were misled into General Wheeler's camp, and they ended up serving for 2 years in the Confederate cavalry. Then they deserted in mass and joined the Union Army and became a cavalry company in the Union Army. Okay, everybody in the family has a cop. My ancestor died of smallpox during the war. He's buried in Indiana. Everybody in the family has a copy of his pension file that we all got from the National Archives and shared with each other. When I was at the National Archives, just for fun, I ordered the pension claim, and written on the outside of the folder was his widow's date of death and where she's buried. And nobody in the family knew that. And we don't even know where the National Archives got that, but there it was. So, like I say, if you get a chance, look through the original pension claim. Look through the original pension claim. And you're saying, well, why don't they copy it all for you? It's because a typical pension file is about this thick. And 99% of what's in there you don't need a copy of. All right. All right. Now, once again, it gets around to being the 1840s, the early 1840s. The United States has a struggle getting people to buy federal lands. Once again, Congress is feeling guilty about how they treat veterans. So in the early 1840s, Congress passes a bill that gives free federal land to every United States veteran or their next of kin, 550,000 people applied for this land. If the federal government had given out all of this land, it would be bigger than the state of Texas. Now, the land that you're going to get will be land in a federal land state like Alabama. If your family, right around the 1840s to about 1860, suddenly moves to a federal land state like Alabama or Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, someplace like that, a federal land state, that's a strong hint somebody is getting military bounty land. You did not have to live in a federal land state to get the bounty land. You only needed to have served in the military. All right. Now you contact the National Archives and they will search for you for a bounty land on your ancestor's service. Now, if your ancestor did serve, and someone applied for bounty land on that service, here's the treasures you can get. If the old soldier applied for the land, you find out where and when he served and where he lives now. All you know about your ancestor is that he came to Alabama, and the census shows, 1850 census shows that he was born in Georgia. Okay? You look at this and it says, I was in the Clark County, Georgia militia against the Indians in 1828. Okay, now you know that he's in Clark County, Georgia. That's the great news. The good news that follows, Clark County, Georgia has every scrap of paper it ever had. So you're in for a treat. Okay. Now, if the old soldier did not live long enough to apply for bounty land, his widow might apply for the bounty land. In her claim, she will tell you uh, when and where she married the old boy, when and where he served. She will give you her maiden name and where she married him, and she will tell you when and where he died. These military bounty claims document thousands of marriages for which no other record survives. All you knew about his wife was that her name was Mary, and you weren't sure that how many Marys he married. I mean, I've seen cases like that with Elizabeths. We thought this guy was married to one Elizabeth all along, and she just lied about her age in the census. No, he was married to three Elizabeths, and each one was younger than his previous wife when he married her. But anyway, with that. So anyway, you get the proof of the marriages, blows a lot of family stories and suppositions out of the water, and gives you valuable information. Now, if the widow did not live, or there was no widow, or the widow did not live long enough to claim the land, the next of kin could. Most of the time, the next of kin are the children. And so you get a claim with the names, it tells you his military service, when and where he died, and gives you the names of all of the children, including the married names of the daughters, because they couldn't claim the land, their husbands had to do it. So again, thousands more marriages are documented through these bounty land claims. Okay, now, the National Archives also has service records, but for volunteer soldiers, which was sort of like the National Guard back then, sort of a temporary National Guard, the service records usually are not a lot of information. They just show that your ancestors served. Now, the good thing, if you've got access on Fold 3 or something to the service records, the good thing is you find 3 or 4 people in the same company who have the same weird last name. For example, you got one company of 64 men who are going off in the Indian Wars, and 4 of them are named Knox. What is that telling you? Probably all 4 of them are some kind of kin. So maybe you should be looking at the others if they're looking at the others. And in fact, if you keep looking at these records long enough, it's kind of like what Nietzsche said about if you stare into the pit long enough, the pit starts to stare back. Okay, you look at the census records and the military records and all this stuff, and you just keep seeing names that keep appearing over and over again. Maybe you should look at those people too. They could be in-laws, they could be cousins. And they can be valuable information, even if they're no relation at all. They just like to hang around with your family and follow them wherever they go. Or maybe it's the other way around. Your family is following them wherever they go. Okay. And again, often state archives and genealogical state archives have special sources for these conflicts. Often genealogical journals will publish muster rolls and things like that for these conflicts that can contain valuable information. Valuable information. All right, the American Civil War. Now, believe it or not, I actually teach an entire class just on the Civil War, and I taught that just a couple of weeks ago. But just on the American Civil War, so we can't go into the same detail, but do look at your handouts for the Union and for Confederate service. There we do go into detail. The American Civil War was of such interest to people, including genealogically, that there are mountains of sources available for the Civil War that are not available for other conflicts. More books have been done on the American Civil War than on any other subject in English, including the Bible. And we live in the golden age of Civil War research where there is so much good stuff available to us to help us find Grandpa than we ever had before. All right, the American Civil War went by many names. Do not be confused. It was also called the War of the Rebellion. It was called the War between the states. The most politically correct name for it would be the War of Southern Secession. It was the old Civil War veterans, North and South, referred to it as a late unpleasantness, like it was a pneumonia outbreak or something. as this goes. And of course, we Southerners like to call it the War of Northern Aggression. All right. When you were going to history class, your teacher said some 600,000 men died in the Civil War. We now know that probably more than 2 million lives were lost as a result of the Civil War, which in a country of only 35 million people at that time, that is a staggering, staggering loss. Okay, now, there are many, many good books on the Civil War, whatever you want to know about the Civil War. There are books on Civil War artifacts and Civil War weapons. There are books on Civil War cooking. You know, I never knew that one of the many different things you could do with mule, but it's there for you, or ways to, serve chicken tartare or something like that if you're really hungry. There are books even on speaking Civil War, what the terms were that they would have used back then. African Americans served in both militaries, and both sides have African American compiled service records at the National Archives. And for anyone who wants to say African Americans who served in the Confederate Army were just feeding the mules and servants to the officers, well, many of the African Americans who served in white federal units were servants as well. However, there were 200,000 African Americans in both federal militaries during the Civil War, and they have the same wonderful records, including pensions and pension files and service records and things of this sort. Native Americans also served in the Civil War. Ironically, most Native Americans, East and West, fought for the Confederacy, although some did fight for the Union. One Native American who was at Appomattox, General Lee supposedly turned to him and said, "You're probably the only real American in this room." To which he didn't reply because how do you answer that? Okay, anyway, it is even believed to be as many as 400 women who dressed as men and joined the Union Army, some of whom went on successful speaking tours after the war. I would have loved to have heard them explain how they got away with that. Okay, anyway, there are many, many good books. There are books and records and other sources on Civil War cemeteries and Civil War prisons. At Wallace State, we have an excellent collection of books on Civil War prisons, North and South. And some states like Georgia, Mississippi, and Virginia have books on Civil War cemeteries. All right, during the American Civil War, Congress formed a committee on the conduct of the war. This committee started during the Civil War, and it's still going strong today. They really crank it up, though, when this country is in war. And they authorized the creation of a monster set of books about the American Civil War, North and South. And this is called The War of the Rebellion, Official Records. It is 158 books. And 158 books. And on your handout, if you will, you can go to a site called Hathy Trust, Hatthi is the first word, and Trust, Trust, is the second word. It has millions of books scanned onto its site that you can word search, and this includes the War of the Rebellion. The War of the Rebellion. It has a Naval Companion series that is also online. As this goes, the National Archives and Records Administration has published numerous books to help you with the War of the Rebellion. It will help you with, like the official atlas of the Civil War that we'll talk about in a little bit. The indexes can be searched by unit. So you want to find out what the 35th Alabama did during the war, you can go to the index to the War of the Rebellion, look under Alabama, look under infantry, look under the 35th, and it will tell you all the places that it has been. It was. All right, many years ago, the Broadfoot Company, which publishes a lot of good books on the Civil War, they published a 100-volume supplement to the War of the Rebellion. Now, the War of the Rebellion is online for free, and you can do word searches on it, and it's just incredible. This supplement is not online, but it comes with a very good index in print. And we have all of this at Wallace. They also have it at all of it at the Birmingham Public Library. Okay, now, the Broadfoot Company did so well in its Civil War books that it went out there to find great books on the American Civil War, particularly those that were full of personal information and names. And they published these wonderful books for us with wonderful indexes. Now, when the Broadfoot Company does an index, they do an index. It is a staggering compilation. The name of every person, the name of every noun, the name of every unit, every state are all in the Broadfoot Index. This is, you're sitting there saying, why can't everything be indexed like this? It's wonderful. All right, let's talk about some of their more popular publications. For example, the old Confederate veterans couldn't wait every month to get the next issue of Confederate Veteran. Now, Confederate Veteran was not put out by the United Confederate Veterans. It was put out by a private company, but it was the official organ for the UCV. And this was a wonderful publication. The old soldiers rehashed their battles and their experiences in there, sometimes as therapy. When an old soldier died, sometimes his friends would put an obituary or a tribute in there on him. Original documents would be found and published. Just absolutely incredible stuff. And it's all extremely well indexed. And Broadfoot reprinted the magazine and did its special Broadfoot Index. I'm kind of ashamed to admit that the black sheep of my family was my several times great-grandfather, Hugh Columbus Martin. He belonged to the 55th Georgia, which was the worst regiment in the Confederate Army. Okay, I looked in his service records, and it was a confused mess. There was something about making shoes in Atlanta, and something about Cumberland Gap, and something about he was a guard at Andersonville, and later at Florence Prison. And like I said, none of this made any sense to me. I go to Confederate Veteran, and the commander of the man who came to command the 55th Georgia wrote a memoir of it for Confederate Veteran, and it makes for incredible reading. The regiment was overran by the Yankees at Cumberland Gap, and the whole regiment was captured and sent to prison for the rest of the war. The commander later escapes. My ancestor was not there because he was sick with smallpox, so they sent him home to Gainesville so he could spread the disease there. While he was there, he married my several times great-grandmother, and the ring bearer was their son, who was a year old at that time. This guy was definitely in the right regiment. All right, it goes on about their original commander who suffered from syphilis, and he should have been a good commander, but he was stealing their wagons and mules and selling them. So they made him dance on top of a stump at bayonet point until he finally resigned from the army. Anyway, this outfit was down to only 3 companies after all the men who knew how to make shoes were transferred to Atlanta to make shoes for the army. The rest of them were sent to Andersonville. They were never guards at Andersonville Confederate Prison because they let it be known that if they were ever put on the wall guarding prisoners, they would open the gates and with the prisoners escape to General Sherman's army. This outfit was so bad that when the other Confederate regulars left Andersonville, they were left behind. The Confederate Army did not want them. Anyway, when Andersonville was abandoned, they went on with the prisoners to Florence and these other prisons. Okay, as this is. But there's more to the story, but it is just too depressing. Anyway, particularly with as far as my ancestor was concerned. But how did I put all of this together? I put it all together because of this article in Confederate Veteran. And you can find the most amazing things there. You can find out things about your ancestor or his close relatives you never knew about. Okay, Confederate Veteran was one of these. Another that they did. In 1898, this publisher decided that he was going to make a fortune by publishing this series of books on the Confederate States of America, and called the Confederate Confederate Military History is the name of the series. Every state got one volume. The Confederate Navy got a volume. The Confederate Secret Service got a volume. And yes, you are allowed to read the Secret Service volume. Okay, but everything got a volume. All right, they sell these in 1898. Every state got a volume, etc. 1898, this is published. This stuff sells like air conditioning to Eskimos. Just nobody's buying it. So then they come up with a clever plan. They will reissue the books in 1900, but they will include a section with biographical sketches of prominent Confederate soldiers. Now, how does someone qualify as a prominent Confederate? Somebody in your family was willing to buy a copy of the book. And so anyway, Alabama's book has over 400 biographical sketches in the back. Georgia's has over 600 biographical sketches. And they're just chock full of wonderful information. And again, this has a Broadfoot index to it. I believe I published in the Alabama Genealogical Quarterly of the 400 Alabama biographical sketches found in the Alabama volume. I know I published the Georgia one as well, but anyway, you don't have to just get to the Broadfoot edition of Confederate Military History and then look at the Broadfoot Index at the end of the series. All right, now, well, we'll move right along about this. The National Archives and Records Administration has the Union records and the largest collection of Confederate records. Guides to these records and others is Henry Pudney Beer's book, The Union. Many National Archives Civil War microfilms are indexed and have been scanned onto Ancestry, Family Search, and Fold 3. Many libraries have Ancestry Library and Fold 3 for use by their patrons. Family Search is a free website. It's put out by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it's open to everyone. All right, after the Civil War, the years go by, and the poor old soldiers need proof of their service in order to get Civil War pensions, North or South. All right, in the northern states, individual adjutant general's offices scraped through the records and published as complete a records of their state adjutant general of their Civil War soldiers as they possibly could. Okay, now on that. And the wonderful thing about it is sometimes these published rosters by the northern states contain information not found anywhere else. You go to your ancestors' National Archives compiled service record, and you find out that he disappeared at Chancellorsville. You don't know if he died there. You don't know if he was captured, deserted, what happened. He just disappeared. You look at the Adjutant General's reports for his state. You look him up, and it says, died at Andersonville, April 1864. You find valuable information like that. Okay, we have the Adjutant General's reports on microfiche at Wallace State by state. Also, there's a site for Andersonville prisoners that is maintained by Carol Lundquist. Her late husband compiled from the Adjutant General's reports all references to prisoners at Andersonville. He discovered that over 600 of the prisoners at Andersonville are buried under false names. At Andersonville, if you were a prisoner, if you lied about your name, you could get a second ration each day. And so some of them apparently were, as I said, buried under the wrong name. And I'd like to think some of them were buried under the wrong name because they didn't want their families to know that they died at a place like Andersonville. Just as I'm sure many Southerners did not want their families to know that they died at Camp Douglas or Elmira or some of the other horrible prison camps. Okay, now anyway, so this is going on and this is getting to be a real problem. So Congress allocates money to the War Department, create compiled service records, that is files, A compiled service record is a file. That's all it is. It's in a big envelope on each of the Union soldiers who served during the Civil War. This will help the old boys to apply for their pensions or their widows to apply for their pensions. Okay. Anyway, they start to work on this and go to town on it. All right, they succeed in doing a compiled service record for each federal soldier. However, they were so worried that the money was going to run out, they did not include a lot of the records. In your handout for researching a Union soldier, I list for you all the many records that are not in a Union Civil War soldier's service record. They only put the minimum in there for purposes of proving your service for a pension. And so there's a lot of stuff in a Union Civil War service record that are left out. And that includes for Southerners who joined the Union Army. And we'll talk more about that. Okay, as this is. Okay, the War Department did the Union soldiers. Then they did the soldiers of the American Revolution. Then they did the soldiers of the War of 1812. Then they did the soldiers of the war with Mexico. Then they did the soldiers of the Indian Wars. And while this is going on, the war with Spain was fought, and they did compile service records for the war with Spain. Finally, the money still kept coming, and as far as I know, the money is still being paid out for this in Washington to somebody. I don't know. But anyway, for the war with Spain. Finally, the money is still coming, and in desperation for something to do, these clerks finally did the Confederate compile service records. Now, if that makes you angry, well, get over it, because by then they knew what they were doing, and the Confederate compile service records are the very best. They are so much more complete than the Union Civil War service records. All right, Napoleon said that an army marches on its stomach, an American army marches on its paperwork. You'll recall from the 407 7th MASH unit who was the most important person there, and that was Radar O'Reilly, the company clerk. The adjutant general is the company clerk for the entire U.S. Army. Everybody writes to the adjutant general. Everyone writes to the adjutant general. Dear adjutant general, you really do not want me in our brave army. I am a coward. I have a terrible back problem, a yellow streak a mile wide. I would keep our brave soldiers at night with my crying and bedwetting. Please do whatever you can to help our glorious cause by not putting me in it. Okay. Now, each side had an adjutant general, and each side got letters from all sorts of people. Everybody wrote to the adjutant general. Both sides had a secretary of war. It might surprise most people to know that the highest ranking person in our military is never a soldier, but is a civilian, the Secretary of War. Today we call this person the Secretary of Defense. I kind of liked it better when it was Secretary of War. All right. During the Civil War, everybody wrote to the Secretary of War. Dear Secretary of War, my brave husband, the father of our 9 adorable children, is fighting for our country in Virginia. He is desperately trying to get a leave to come home to be with us at Christmas. Don't give it to him. Signed, 9 is enough. Okay. Anyway, you can find anything and everything in these letters. They're just wonderful. All right. This is National Archives microfilm, and some of this at least, has been scanned onto Fold 3. We have at Wallace State the indexes to the letters received by the adjutant generals and the letters received by the secretaries of war for both sides. And for the Confederacy, we have on microfilm the letters received by the Confederate adjutant general and by the Confederate secretary of war. Okay. All right, many records were lost, but especially for the Confederacy, but many survive in state archives, historical societies, special collections at universities, etc. Many institutions cross-reference their material by Civil War unit so that you can find writings of men who served with your soldier. All right. Okay, now here's some of the records that you will not find. First off, I love Union, don't get the wrong idea. I love Union Civil War service records. A typical Union Civil War service record will tell you the soldier's county and state of birth, age, physical description, what happened to him during the war, something like that, and other valuable information. However, here's some of the things that were left out because they didn't know that their program was going to go on forever. Okay. They exclude the medical records. You have to write to the National Archives separately to get a soldier's medical records. Um, they do not include the muster-in books. And the muster-in book, when it survives, tells you the residence of the soldier. So you've got two soldiers with the same name, either one of whom could be the man you're looking for. You go to the muster-in book and see where they were living at the time they mustered in. Uh, there are separate records at the National Archives for prisoners of war. See the handout. There is no comprehensive index to all Union Civil War service records. However, I find that if I go to Ancestry and I type in, most of the time, if I'm looking for a Civil War soldier, Ancestry will get me the name and the unit. And the name and the unit is all I usually really need to find the records. Ancestry has the federal draft records from the Civil War. The Confederate draft records have not survived. Okay, now, after the Civil War, your federal soldier or sailor could have gotten free federal land under the Homestead Act, and they got 1 year knocked off of the homestead requirement. There's an 8-year requirement on the homesteads. They got 1 year knocked off for every year of military service. Every year of military service. Needless to say, the United States government did not give that to the Confederate veterans. Wonder why. All right, as this goes. All right, federal homestead land was in federal land states like Alabama and Kansas. Pensions for federal service, including for African Americans and for Confederate prisoners who joined the Union Army. Picture this. We're at one of those wonderful club feds like Camp Douglas. All right, your ancestor is a skinny bag of bones wearing a filthy rag, and he's just put his boyhood friend on the dead wagon. Along comes a burly Irish recruiting sergeant. He puts his arm around your ancestor, first warmth your ancestors felt in days, and said, "Lad, don't you know, tomorrow we'll be putting you on the dead wagon." And your ancestor looks up and has a very profound, "Yup." "No, lad, it doesn't need to be that way. I'm talking about not just a change in attitude, but a change in latitude. If you come over and join us, we'll get you a nice, pretty uniform that's warm. We will feed you good Army chow, and we'll pay you good Army pay, just like you were always one of us. And when you get old enough, you or your widow can get a wonderful federal pension." And your ancestor looks at shock at the Irishman and says, "I beg your pardon? I will give myself up to God before I would dare shoot at my kin." "No, lad, you're not understanding me. We'd be stupid to be giving muskets to you Johnnies to shoot at us. No, lad, we're sending you out west to help guard the Indians, to protect them, don't you know? Wonderful people the Indians are. I'm talking about the Apaches, the Comanches, the Sioux, the Cheyenne. You won't want to leave. Arizona is such a green and wonderful Garden of Eden." And these soldiers became the galvanized Yankees. In your Confederate compiled service record, if you see where your ancestor joined the Union Army, there's also a federal compiled service record for him with all sorts of good information in it. And we have these for the so-called galvanized Yankees at Wallace State. Okay, now the federal government, the U.S. Congress discovered that pension bills veterans benefits are a way of getting votes. And so eventually they are giving pensions to veterans, to widows, to children of veterans, to parents of veterans. and on and on. By 1900, 40% of the federal budget is going to pay for federal Civil War pensions. The Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz represents the federal Civil War pensioners. Remember what the wizard tells the lion at the end? My friend, you are confusing a justified concern for your personal safety with cowardice. Why, where I come from, every year men put on their uniforms and they march down the street, and they have no more courage than you do. But they've got something you don't. And the lion says, courage? No, a medal. And the medal was a metaphor for a federal pension. You could get a federal Civil War pension if you only served as little as 7 days. As little as 7 days. A widow of a federal Civil War veteran, she was making more money in a month for doing nothing than the average working man who was supporting his family. Okay, so you order these pensions from the National Archives, and they can be a gold mine of information, particularly if there is the least bit of problem with the pension. And sometimes there was a lot of problems with the pensions, but we don't have the time today for all of those stories. Okay, the individual states and the United States government ran soldiers' homes. And eventually the northern soldiers' homes were taken over by the federal government to spare the states the expense. And one of the great ironies is that the northern soldiers' homes admitted Confederate veterans. And that must have led to some lively dinner conversations. Okay. The National Tribune. The National Tribune is still with us. Today we call it the Stars and Stripes. But the National Tribune was the newspaper of the Union veterans of the Civil War. It was a lot like Confederate Veteran. It had obituaries in it. It had memories of speeches, of events in the Civil War. It had questions. It had wonderful things in it. Now, the National Tribune is free on the Library of Congress's word searchable newspaper site. Now, this is a monster website the Library of Congress runs for free, where they have scanned millions of pages of newspapers. And among the newspapers they scanned was the National Tribune. So you type in your ancestor's name, and in addition to checking the Wabash Cannonball or something for your ancestor, it'll also check the National Tribune to see if your ancestor is mentioned or sent in a letter. And of course, you can also search it by unit or by place like Andersonville or Gettysburg. And this is the Library of Congress's free newspaper site called Chronicling America. All right, let's talk about researching the Confederacy. Henry Putney Beers did a wonderful book called The Union, which tells you in glorious detail the records of the United States Union service in the Civil War. He did a companion volume called The Confederacy. Okay, now what Beers does in both books, and his books are fabulous by themselves, but they go a step further. He asked every major archives in the country if they had any Civil War records, Civil War government records. And in both the Union and in the Confederacy, if there are other records in another repository, he tells you about them in the book. But anyway, Henry Putney Beers, the Union, Henry Putney Beers, the Confederacy. All right, now, in addition to the literally tons of Confederate records that the United States government seized at the end of the war, the National Archives also has some very special sources. The Citizens File. The Citizens File is about 2,000 microfilm reels. 2,000 microfilm reels of private individuals and companies that did business with the Confederacy. They have an index of the big companies, but not the little guys. And of course, it might be your ancestor who's one of the little guys. I looked up my ancestor, Jonas B. Davis, and he was a blacksmith in Hall County, Georgia. And he's asking for an exemption for his 3 sons from the Confederate draft, because they're the only blacksmith in the county. And so the county would really be suffering if they left. His oldest son is his partner. His second son is his apprentice. And the third son, who's my ancestor, is sweeping up the floors. Okay, that's all well and good, but his two oldest sons were drafted in anyway, and one of them disappeared into the smoke at Baker's Creek, and the other is buried at the federal prison at Fort Delaware. Okay, but anyway, the citizens' files, well worth taking a look at. Now, as I said, there are 2,000 reels of microfilm. I've got some good news and some better news. First, good news is the files are in alphabetical order, and we have them at Wallace State. Second good news is that they are on the free genealogical website, Family Search, the free site Family Search. All right, when the War Department got through creating the Confederate Compiled Service records, they found that they had a few records left, about 475 microfilm reels of records left. These were records of Confederate soldiers that they could not match up to a unit. So what do they do with it? They put these records in alphabetical order, and we have them on microfilm at Wallace State. They may also be on fold 3, I don't know. You might want to check on that. Okay. Now, for those of us who have been in the military, we know what the provost marshal is. The provost marshal is in charge of military security or military police. Okay, a really good provost marshal is somebody who is mean as a snake and trusts no one. During the Civil War, the Union had the most effective provost marshal in its history, Marcellina Patterson. This guy was vicious. He told his provost marshals to gather up any Southern papers they could get their hands on to be used in mass trials of Confederates after the war. Okay, so we have those records, about 1,200 microfilm reels of it at Wallace State. Very well indexed and very easy to use. And you can find almost anything imaginable in those records, including records of civilians too, I should add, including records. Some states, okay, we've talked about the cemetery records already. All right. Okay, Confederate pensions are a little complicated to explain. The United States government did not give pensions to Confederate veterans and widows until 1953. At that time, there was one Confederate veteran. He'd been a boy who watered the mules, and there were 12 widows. So who gives pensions to Confederate veterans and widows? And the answer is the individual states. Each of the 11 Confederate states, plus the states of Missouri, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, also gave pensions to Confederate veterans and widows. Now, the operative word here is resident Confederate veterans and Confederate widows. Your ancestor served in the 3rd South Carolina Heavy Artillery, but his widow lives in Alabama after the Civil War. It'll be the state of Alabama, not the state of South Carolina, that gives him his pension. Your ancestor was in the 13th Virginia during the Civil War, but as an old man, he lives in Texas. It'll be the state of Texas that gives him his pension. Now, what if your ancestor lived in a state that did not give Confederate veterans and their widows pensions? Then what they would do is they would write back to the southern state where he served, and that state would send them a pension. That was the only exception to the residency rule. Otherwise, if the pensions went to resident Confederate veterans and their widows. All right, each of the states that gave Confederate pensions did so in their own warm and wonderfully wacky way. South Carolina is the worst. They didn't even keep files on their pensioners until 1915. Alabama, as was usually the case, kept the best records and the best resources on this. with regards to the pensions. And the Alabama pensions are widely available, and I believe they are on fold 3, unless I'm mistaken on that. Now, okay, there are many records associated with the Confederate pensions, depending on state. That can be a huge benefit to you. The states of Alabama, Georgia, Missouri, and Texas, before the federal compiled service records existed, created card catalogs of their Confederate soldiers. We have the card catalogs for all 4 of those states on microfilm at Wallace State: Alabama, Georgia, Missouri, and Texas. Several states, North and South, published their Civil War rosters. We've already talked about the northern states with their adjutant generals' reports. North Carolina, Tennessee, and Florida have statewide publications of their Civil War service records. And the North Carolina one, which is a modern project, is just absolutely superb. You wish someone would do that for every state. Okay, now, moving right along here. Okay, each state archives that gave pensions, the state archives of each state that gave pensions, also has letters received from by their pension office, and usually it's from someone who can't get a pension, who's pleading with them to give him a pension anyway, trying to provide additional evidence, things of this sort. There are annual lists of pensions at each state archives, and if you don't know exactly when your Civil Confederate ancestor died, go through these annual pension lists, county by county, by the county he lived in, until he or she drops off the pension list. That's usually a pretty good clue as that's when they died, when they're not being paid anymore for their pension. Okay. Okay. Blah 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 blah. Okay. Only Georgia. I say only Georgia and Texas. Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas have published records of the soldiers who stayed at their soldiers' homes. Alabama had a soldiers' farm near Clanton, and it's now a state park. And their records have never been, the records of the inmates of the Alabama Confederate Pension Farm, Confederate Veterans Farm, have never been published. All right, South Carolina and Tennessee also gave Confederate pensions to African Americans who served. There are, however, many good books out there on African Americans in the Confederate Army. All right, these pensions also spurred some very special records in certain states. Alabama conducted a 1907 and a 1921 census of its resident Confederate veterans. And this is the most wonderful record for each Confederate veteran living in Alabama. It gives you his county and state of birth, gives you his date of birth, gives you his Confederate service. The 1907 census has been published, and both censuses are included in those little white cards for Alabama that the pension office had. 1927, they did a census of Alabama's widows of Confederate veterans, a census of the widows of Confederate veterans. And in 1920, the state of Alabama asked its Confederate veterans, what was the name of your wife's husband? Where and when was she born? Where and when did you marry her? Ironically, the one question they didn't ask the veteran is, who is your wife? Okay, as it goes. Now, the state of Tennessee, the lady who ran their pension office, she comes up with a clever idea. She sends a genealogical questionnaire to each of the veterans getting a pension from the state of Tennessee or from the federal government and living in the state of Tennessee. Most of the pensioners just threw this into the trash and ignored it. But those who didn't and sent the questionnaires back, the questionnaires are a gold mine of information, and they've been published. The lady who ran the Arkansas Confederate Pension Office, she thought this was such a great idea. She came up with an even bigger genealogical questionnaire for Arkansas's Confederate veterans. and those have been published too. And we have both of them in print at Wallace State, and we have the original Arkansas questionnaires on microfilm. All right, the American Civil War was so terrible, it was so terrible, that the United States pretty much stayed out of military affairs from 1866 until 1898. The war, and even then, we had problems with the war. Most of what goes on in that period of time, well, actually, most of what goes on from 1866 to 1917 is minor. Well, I guess it's not minor if you were there, but campaigns against the Indians, things of that sort. Now, if you go to the Alabama Archives, or you go to Lynn Henley Park across from the Birmingham Public Library, you will see a statue of an Alabama soldier, and he's wearing a floppy hat, and he's wearing an ammunition belt, he's carrying a strange-looking rifle, and he has boots and leggings on. And when you look at the statue, it says, "In memory of the Alabama soldiers of the war with Spain, the Philippine insurrection, and the Boxer Rebellion." Alabama has a proud tradition in its National Guard, and we still do today. But the National Guard has a motto, first in and last out in any American conflict. And sadly, that is true. All right, 1898, the United States goes to war with Spain. The Alabama National Guard is right there in the thick of it. They had some idea that because we lived so far to the south, Alabamians were immune to malaria. Yeah, I know that's laughable, but that's what they thought in the War Department. Okay, anyway, the Alabama National Guard is in the Philippines when we took it from Spain. When we freed the Philippine people from Spanish rule, the Philippine people decided they wanted to be freed from our rule. And this became the Philippine insurrection. It finally ended when we cut a deal with the Philippine rebels that we would give them everything but independence, and we would give them independence in 1945. And the reason it took until 1948 is the Japanese invasion. But Americans and Filipinos fought side by side against the Japanese. Okay, now while the Alabama National Guard is fighting against in the Philippine insurrection, the Chinese rise up, and in their hands to heaven rebellion, determined to cleanse China of all things Western. Anyway, we didn't understand any of this, particularly when they're attacking us with judo, which we didn't know what martial arts were. So anyway, we just called it the Boxer Rebellion because they were always doing this stuff with their hands. Okay, we called it the Boxer Rebellion. Anyway, as this goes, and the Alabama National Guard was in the thick of it. All right, in 1916, the Bandito rebel leader Pancho Villa attacked Colorado, New Mexico. And he and his banditos had their rear ends kicked by the locals who shot them full of holes. However, the American people were so upset that we occupied Mexico, a third of Mexico, for 6 months. And as far as we know, our military never even saw Pancho Villa. But again, the Alabama National Guard is in the thick of it. All right, the National Archives has records of the service from all of these miscellaneous campaigns prior to World War I. The records have all survived. They're at the National Archives. You can search them. Also, check the state archives to see if your ancestors in the National Guard were involved in any of these campaigns. Oh, and by the way, they qualified for pensions, federal pensions. All right. The records of the U.S. military from 1918, that is World War I, to the present time, are kept at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. This enormous building did not have fire suppression equipment because they said the chances of it catching fire was so small that there's a greater danger that the sprinkler system would go off and damage the records. In 1973, the building was struck by lightning, and the situation was so bad that the top floor 3 days later had to be taken off. These are the records from the service in World War I, 1917 to 1973. They include Korean War, Vietnam, Cold War service. All of those records were gone, were burnt, were almost all those records were lost in the fire. Since 1973, the National Archives has been spending more than $1 million a year going through federal warehouses, looking for records to replace the records that were damaged in the fire. So if you're looking for a relative who served from 1917 to the present, your first stop, believe it or not, is the National Personnel Records Center. Go to the National Archives, NARA's website, fill out the form for a modern service rep. They will look for it at the National Personnel Records Center, and they will see if they have found any records to make up for the records lost in the fire. Now I have a secret to share with you, and I know all of you here and those of you at home will keep this secret. Let's not blab it out. They're using all these wonder toys that we've developed the last few years. And the National Archives, in a moment of wisdom, decided not to throw out the ashes from the fire. They kept the ashes. And now, using all these wonderful technical wizardry, they are reading what the documents said before they were burned. And they've been going at this for about 4 years now. I have no idea how many records they have restored so far, but they've done an amazing job with it. And so, again, write to the National Personnel Records Center. Maybe your relatives' lost records have been restored using some sort of X-ray technique and such through the burned files, Ma'am? And you got the records? Oh. Have them reconstructed anyway because they probably don't know what they're talking about. The lady wrote for a relative's records. The National Archives said we could reconstruct the record from what we've got, but why would you want it? You would be surprised what can be found in those reconstructed records. It can be staggering. And like I said, in the next few years, don't be the least bit surprised if they reconstruct his entire file. All right. Okay, now, let's talk about some substitutes for the lost records. Let's talk about some of the substitutes. Okay, again, go back to the state archives and see if the state archives has a copy of the records. Now, after World War I, it was determined by President Woodrow Wilson that thanks to his League of Nations, there would never be another war again, and that the terrible losses of the First World War would be justified by saving us from future wars. As a consequence of this, the Pentagon gave every state a set of the service records for every one of the World War I soldiers. The Alabama Archives has this, Georgia Archives has this, and they're all on Ancestry. They're all on Ancestry. The World War I service records. Okay. And like I said, always check the state archives. Okay. Other sources you can go to for the lost records. Other sources you can go to. Check the hometown newspaper at the time of the war. Hometown newspapers love to publish letters from soldiers at the front. And of course, they would also include if the soldier was died or disappeared or something like that, that would be published in the hometown papers too. President Roosevelt insisted that nothing be kept back from the American people if it could be avoided. Okay, but check with your newspapers. Alabama has many, many newspapers that have been scanned onto the site newspapers.com, newspapers.com. And many libraries like the Birmingham Public Library, have newspapers.com free for the public to use in their libraries. Check with your local public library. If you know that when your uncle died in World War II, contact them, and very likely they will check the local newspapers for you for that time and send you a copy of any articles about your relatives passing. All right, Ancestry.com has digitized the draft records for World War I right up until the 1970s. Now, why did they stop at the 1970s? Because in the 1970s, they started putting on the draft records your social security numbers. So that's from that time on. However, if you're a veteran or something, you can go there and you can look. Remember my telling you I signed up for the draft? I can go to the National Archives at Atlanta and I can look at my draft card, you know. So can you if you have a draft card as such. Okay, and anyway, if you want a draft card from after the 1970s, contact the National Archives and find out where the original records are kept. Okay, the earlier ones have been scanned, particularly for World War I and World War II, on the Ancestry.com website. The American dead of the First World War, most of whom died from the Spanish flu in America, were published in a book, Soldiers of the Great War, along with photographs when photographs were available. Okay, now, Google. Okay, the first thing you need to do to find a modern veteran or whatever is to find out their unit. It's nice if you have their serial number, but their unit is much more important. Google the veterans, Google the soldier or sailor or airman's unit. Google it. And don't be the least bit surprised if there's a website devoted to that unit. And if it's recent enough, like your ancestor died in Korea, I personally think the Korean War per soldier produced more widows and orphans than any conflict in American history. But if it's a Korean conflict, don't be the least bit surprised if you can find living survivors of the unit who can tell you all about your dead service person, your veteran. My father did that. He was in the Korean conflict, and my father didn't like going out or doing things much. But when he contacted his old unit, they had an annual reunion for years and years. He never missed a one. Las Vegas, Washington, all these places he would never have gone on his own, he went to for his unit reunion, had a wonderful time. And I thought that was great. Also, if your ancestor served on a ship, the ship may have a website too. As I said before, each branch of the military has an archive. Each branch of the military has an archive. You can contact that archive and see about any records, including ship yearbooks, unit histories, things of this sort that can tell you about the unit at least. And sometimes you, like I say, in any of this stuff, there's always a chance you're actually going to stumble into the soldier or sailor themselves. All right. What to do with all this information? What to do with all this information? All right. Interview your veterans that you know and interview the veterans in your family while they're still here to be interviewed. And you will get some priceless stories and priceless information that otherwise you might lose that they will take with you. Let me warn you, however, that the more you study a soldier's military past and events, the more tempted you are to write a unit history, particularly if it is of the Civil War. And the next thing you know, you're writing a regimental history of your ancestors' outfit and having a grand time doing it. Join a military heraldry society or an interest group, even if only on Facebook. And there are hundreds of these sites on Facebooks for every conflict you could imagine. And there are some that have monthly luncheons and things of this sort, like the Birmingham Sons of the American Revolution, the United Sons and Daughters of the War of 1812. I think I've spoken to every single group. I think the last time I spoke to a group at the club, it was the United Sons and Daughters of Reconstruction. But I mean, there's some of these, there's a group for all of these, and you can get involved. And even if you're not much on a research, you can enjoy the camaraderie and the speakers that they have. Visit the battlefields and the sites. Visit the battlefields and the sites. And of course, a battlefield on a historic site is all the more interesting to you if you know your ancestor was there. And even if your ancestor served in World War II, there are tours of the World War II battlefields and such in France. And that makes for an amazing, absolutely amazing tour on that. But visit the battlefields and the sites. And most of all, let us remember our veterans. Let us remember our veterans. Years ago, I was returning from Canada with my half brother Gus, and he had never been to Washington, D.C., so I thought we'd go there for the afternoon. And you have to be careful about what to do in Washington in the afternoon because there's so much to do and so little time to do it in. So I took him to some place I knew was always open and always had parking, and that's the Vietnam War Memorial. And Gus had no family in the Vietnam War at all, and it was all before he was born and the rest of it. But the monument brought him to tears, and I'm standing there, and there's these two women a few feet away from me, and one of them turns to the other and says, "Well, I can't find him. Let's go." And I came up to them and said, "Ma'am, if you'll tell me who you're looking for, there's an index over there, and I'll find them in the index." And they told me who. I ran and got it and gave it to the first lady. And I took her to where it was at. And she said, "That's him, that's him." And I said, "If you let me go get one of the nice park rangers, and they'll give you a piece of paper and a pencil, and you can make a rubbing." She said, "Thank you." And then as I turned around to go get the park ranger, I heard her say, "He's my son." I tell you, I came closest to hitting the ground. Anyway, I grabbed the park ranger, sent him on, grabbed Gus, and we left. All right, my poor history students. I all the time suffer them with questions they don't know, they couldn't possibly know the answers to, although sometimes they surprise me. They figure it out. And so I'm going to end today's talk with one such question and then ask for questions from the audience. Okay, this was added to the Vietnam War Memorial here, the three soldiers that you're looking at. Okay, and you walk through this Cheops of wool of trees, past the soldiers, and then you go down to the monument. All right, what do the three soldiers represent? They're ghosts who've come back to see if we remembered them. All right, so questions from the floor. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. The Confederate Veteran, the magazine of the Confederate Veteran, United Confederate Veterans. Okay, it's at a lot of major libraries. It may even be here. The Birmingham Public Library has it. I have it at my Wallace State in Hansville. It has a Broadfoot index. It's nothing complicated to use at all. It's wonderful. Not online, I don't think so. Oh, no, I should have. I should have mentioned it. It's in the paperwork. Forgive me. I forgot that from the talk. All right, starting with the American Civil War, veterans were encouraged to register their service record at the county courthouse of their residence. So let's say your ancestor uh, came home from the war to this county. You would go to the county probate court. You would ask to look for his service records, and they would open these big books. Sometimes the books say World War I, but they also include Korea and Vietnam. Okay, the lady said she went there and the courthouse turned her down, saying it was only for the veteran. It all depends on which courthouse you go to and which state you're going to. Unfortunately, right now, for example, in Georgia, they passed a law a couple of years ago to try to shut down any future access to birth and death records by anybody. Right now, we're fighting that law right now in Georgia. Everywhere you go these days, somebody is trying to shut down records just to show that they're a horse's rear end, not for any privacy reasons or protection reasons or anything like that. But if you can go to a courthouse and you can see this record, you get the basic record, you get the name of the veteran, you get where and when he served, and you get that he had an honorable discharge. It will also mention if he got a Purple Heart or he received the Medal of Honor. And just those two awards only, because those are the only two awards where you get special veterans benefits if you have them. You can have a chest full of other medals, and that doesn't count for veterans benefits. No, not for him. It'll only be the county he came home to. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I don't know if it's a state law or not. Or it's just a courthouse official being, I don't know that it's outlawed in the state of Alabama. I've never had to ask. In Georgia, often these records are even microfilmed for the public to use. Some more good questions. And those were excellent questions. Yes, ma'am. Okay, well, the lady is asking me about someone who is a U.S. Marshal on the Trail of Tears. Okay, I know nothing about U.S. Marshals on the Trail of Tears. However, having said that, U.S. Marshals are appointed by the Attorney General. They are, a U.S. Marshal is a civilian, okay? Now, there will be records at the National Archives that he was a U.S. Marshal. They have records of those at the National Archives. Unfortunately, you may have to hire someone or you may have to go yourself to look at them. Okay, in whatever records they've got of him, there may be a record of the injury. You might want to check the newspapers on newspapers.com or something like that to see if there's somebody published a story about that. But as I say, these are Justice Department records, the records of the U.S. Marshal Service. Also, the U.S. Marshal Service has a website, and I'm sure they have a historical society, and you can contact them. And they are experts in researching the U.S. Marshal Service, and they can be a huge help to you. At the very least, they can steer you in the right direction, and they may have some records on at their fingertips that they can go to on that. I know that the Marshal Service keeps a close record of their marshals over the years. Now, the trouble is that most of the people who served the U.S. Marshal Service in the early days were deputy U.S. Marshals like Wyatt Earp, and any U.S. Marshal can appoint as many deputy marshals as he chooses. And so records of them are too far and too rare and too far in between. Well, as far as trying to find the records go, you have to understand the National Archives. It is an enormous group of records. It has always been terribly underfunded. It used to be the kind of place where someone would work there for decades and acquire a huge amount of knowledge and be just a tremendous amount of help. Now you go to the National Archives, as with many archives, I'm sad to say, state archives too, and you're dealing with someone who's only been there a short time, and you may know more about the records you're looking for than they do. I've had that experience. This country could really do better in saving our past and remembering our past than what we do. So, another good question or interesting story or situation. Well, I want to thank you for being a wonderful audience.